Everyone is calling it a European victory. The headlines are celebrating. Brussels is holding press conferences. The Financial Times used the word triumph. Analysts who have spent 3 years warning about European industrial collapse are suddenly writing about strategic resilience and sovereign capability. And on the surface, looking at the numbers from last week's EU-China trade summit, you could almost believe them. Almost, because here is what the mainstream coverage is missing. The agreement that Europe just signed with China is not a victory. It is a mortgage, and the collateral is something that Brussels does not yet fully understand. It has put on the table. I want to walk you through the actual architecture of this deal today. Not the press release version, not the diplomatic language about mutual benefit and balanced growth. The real architecture, the financial flows, the industrial implications, the strategic leverage transfer that is embedded in the fine print of a $8 trillion economic relationship. And I want to do something unusual. I want to show you why China, despite appearing to make concessions, is the party that left last week's summit having gotten precisely what it came for. I have spent a decade analyzing Sino-European trade dynamics. I have studied every major negotiation between Brussels and Beijing since the comprehensive agreement on investment collapsed in 2021. And the pattern I see in last week's agreement is not new. But its scale is unprecedented, and its consequences will reshape the global economic order in ways that the victory narrative completely obscures. The European Union and China concluded a framework trade agreement at last week's Brussels summit that has been widely characterized as a breakthrough after 4 years of negotiations frozen by geopolitical tensions. The headline numbers are genuinely significant. China committed to reducing tariffs on 847 European product categories, valued at approximately 380 billion euros in annual export volume. European electric vehicle manufacturers received an agreement in principle that would modify the punitive 1% tariffs that Beijing imposed in 2024. European pharmaceutical companies secured expedited regulatory pathways for 43 drug categories. European luxury goods, luxury goods, representing 94 billion euros in annual sales, received tariff reductions averaging 4 percentage points. By every surface metric, Europe appeared to extract substantial concessions. The Financial Times described it as the most significant bilateral trade achievement since the European Central Bank's 2015 currency swap arrangement with the People's Bank of China. Ursula von der Leyen cited it as proof of European strategic autonomy. Multiple European heads of state appeared at the announcement ceremony. Now let me show you what Europe gave in return, because this is the part of the story that received approximately 4 paragraphs of coverage in total, buried after 17 paragraphs celebrating the wins. Europe agreed to 3 categories of concessions that, when their economic value is properly calculated, transform the optics of this deal entirely. Concession 1, market access for Chinese electric vehicles. In exchange for the tariff modifications on European EVs entering China, the EU agreed to a phased reduction of its own protective tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, dropping from 1% to 22%, 4% by 2027 and to 14%, 7% by 2030. European Commission staff analysis, subsequently leaked to Politico, estimated that at Chinese EV production cost advantages, which currently run approximately 8,200 euros per vehicle below comparable European models, these tariff levels remain protective. But only barely, and the trajectory moves in one direction only. Concession 2, rare earth processing infrastructure. Europe agreed to not impose additional restrictions on Chinese rare earth processing companies establishing operations within EU member states under the guise of domestic production partnerships. This sounds technical. It is enormously consequential. China controls 87% of global rare earth processing capacity. The EU's Critical Raw Materials Act, passed in 2023, set a target of processing 40% of its own rare earth consumption domestically by 2030. That target assumed European-controlled processing facilities. Chinese-owned facilities operating on European soil count toward the target statistically. They do not deliver the supply security the Act was designed to create. Concession 3, the Digital Infrastructure Access Provisions. Buried in Annex 7 of the Framework Agreement are provisions allowing Chinese telecommunications infrastructure companies, specifically Huawei and ZTE affiliates, to participate in 5G expansion projects in 5 EU member states that had previously maintained exclusion policies. The stated economic rationale involves accelerating European digital infrastructure development at lower cost. The Center for Strategic and International Studies published an assessment in March of this year noting that telecommunications infrastructure access represents the most durable form of economic intelligence access in the modern era. Add the economic value of these 3 concession categories. The EV tariff reduction trajectory implies a €67 billion shift in automotive market share over 7 years, according to European Automobile Manufacturers Association projections. The rare earth processing provision forecloses approximately €140 billion in potential European industrial development. The telecommunications concessions carry a strategic intelligence value that cannot be precisely quantified, but that American and British intelligence services have, in leaked assessments, described as equivalent to handing Beijing permanent visibility into European industrial planning. The headline number Europe secured was €380 billion in tariff relief on exports. The number Europe gave away was substantially larger, but it does not appear on a single press release. To understand why China made the concessions it made, you need to understand a concept that Chinese economic planners apply with remarkable discipline: the distinction between concessions that cost you nothing and concessions that cost you everything. China's tariff reductions on European luxury goods cost China almost nothing. European luxury consumption in China is driven by aspirational demographics that are relatively price inelastic. A 12-point tariff reduction on a €3,500 handbag moves the Chinese consumer price by approximately €420. Studies published in the Journal of International Economics have consistently found that luxury goods demand in China's upper-income tiers is status-driven rather than price-driven. The tariff reduction generates positive headlines for Beijing at essentially zero economic cost to Chinese domestic producers who do not compete in the luxury segment. China's pharmaceutical pathway agreements cost China very little. The regulatory expediting provisions apply to drug categories where Chinese domestic manufacturing does not compete meaningfully. China gains international reputation as a market opening while protecting its pharmaceutical industrial base. China's EV concession is more complex. But even here, the calculus favors Beijing. The 1% tariff that China imposed in 2024 was always partly performative, set at a level designed to be negotiated down, not to permanently exclude European vehicles. European EVs at current price points serve a Chinese premium market segment that Chinese manufacturers have not fully penetrated. Allowing limited European EV access to that segment while securing the tariff reduction trajectory on Chinese vehicles entering Europe is a trade that China's electric vehicle industry, the most globally competitive in the world, would take every time. Here is the number that crystallizes the asymmetry. China's CATL, the world's largest battery manufacturer, controls 8% of the global electric vehicle battery market. Its European rival, Northvolt, filed for bankruptcy protection last year. The European EV industry that this trade deal is nominally designed to support is, at its competitive core, dependent on Chinese battery supply chains for the foreseeable future. The European manufacturers that will benefit most from reduced Chinese tariffs on their vehicles are companies that source significant portions of their battery chemistry from Chinese suppliers. Europe is celebrating improved market access for products that require Chinese industrial inputs to produce. That is not a victory. That is vertical integration, Chinese style. I want to draw a parallel that makes this structural dynamic unmistakably clear. In the early 20th century, the British textile industry struck a series of trade agreements with Indian cotton producers that appeared, on their face, to be mutually beneficial. Britain received cheaper raw cotton. India received guaranteed market access for agricultural output. The terms were favorable to both parties in the immediate transaction. The mechanism that those agreements obscured was this: India was locked into supplying raw inputs while Britain controlled the manufacturing value added. The trade relationship that appeared balanced was structurally designed to keep India in a permanent position of raw material supplier rather than finished goods producer. The economic historian Utsa Patnaik, in research published by Columbia University Press, calculated the total wealth extraction enabled by this structural arrangement at approximately $45 trillion in today's values over 2 centuries. I am not suggesting that Europe's situation is analogous in scale or in the coercive power dynamics of colonialism. I am making a precise structural point about how trade relationships that appear balanced in their immediate terms can embed dependencies that compound across decades. The dependency that this week's EU-China agreement embeds is this: Europe maintains finished goods exports to China in categories luxury, pharmaceuticals, specialized industrial equipment, where Chinese domestic competition is limited. China maintains upstream control of the inputs: aprosas, linear, mansamir, guineasamir, dir, batteries, rare earths, digital infrastructure, EV platforms that European industrial competitiveness increasingly requires. Europe is exporting the downstream. China is locking in the upstream. In the short term, Europe's export industries celebrate because their market access has improved. In the medium term, every European automotive engineer knows that the company whose battery architecture you depend on is the company that sets your competitive ceiling. And China set that ceiling this week. The $8 trillion figure in this deal's title represents the total projected bilateral trade volume that this agreement is designed to govern over its initial 10-year framework period. That is the economic landscape over which the terms we just discussed will operate. Let us map what China's position within that landscape looks like and what Europe's looks like. China enters this framework controlling battery technology for the electrification transition, rare earth processing for both civilian and military applications, digital infrastructure for the 5G build-out in 5 member states, price-competitive electric vehicle platforms that will gradually render European alternatives uncompetitive as tariffs decline, and the dominant manufacturing position in solar panels and wind turbine components that Europe's Green Deal requires. Europe enters this framework controlling luxury goods, pharmaceuticals, specialized industrial machinery, aircraft, and financial services. These are valuable. They are not the commanding heights of the industrial transition that will define economic power over the next 30 years. The $8 trillion question embedded in this deal's title is not whether Europe won this negotiation. The question is this: of the $8 trillion in trade that flows through this framework over a decade, which party will have leveraged that relationship to build durable industrial capabilities, and which party will have cashed in existing advantages without building new ones? China has answered that question through the structure of every concession it made. It opened luxury markets it does not need to protect. It maintained strategic choke points it cannot afford to relinquish. It secured the tariff trajectory on electric vehicles that its industry requires to complete European market penetration. And it embedded its telecommunications infrastructure and rare earth processing into European territory in ways that will prove extraordinarily difficult to reverse. Here is what this means for you directly. European energy transition costs depend on battery prices. Battery prices depend on rare earth processing costs. Rare earth processing costs depend on Chinese industrial capacity. European consumers are about to spend the next decade discovering that the green transition they were promised has a Chinese price embedded in its foundation. The EU's own projections, published in its Strategic Technologies for Europe platform report, estimate that without domestic rare earth processing, European battery costs will run 23 to 34% above Chinese equivalents through 2035. That cost difference does not stay inside corporate margins. It moves into electricity bills, into the cost of heating your home, into the price of transportation, into the competitiveness of every European manufacturer whose energy costs are determined by an industrial input chain that this trade agreement just confirmed will remain Chinese-controlled. Step back further and ask a different question. What was China's actual objective at this summit? The conventional analysis assumes that China wanted market access, that it wanted the headline win of a major trade agreement to demonstrate diplomatic normalcy after years of tension with the West, that it wanted the symbolic victory of European engagement to counterbalance American pressure. But the deeper objective, consistent with every major Chinese trade engagement over the past decade, natural, is this: lock in structural positions before the competitive dynamics shift. China's electric vehicle industry is currently the most competitive in the world, but that advantage is not permanent. European manufacturers are investing heavily. American manufacturers are recovering. If China does not secure market access and tariff trajectory commitments now, while its cost advantage is at its peak, it risks facing a mature, competitive landscape in 5 years with fewer agreed frameworks in place. China's rare earth processing monopoly is secure today but faces challenge. American, Australian, and European investments in alternative processing capacity are accelerating. The window in which Chinese processing dominance translates into maximum strategic leverage is finite. Embedding Chinese processing infrastructure into European territory extends that window by years. The Huawei telecommunications provisions are perhaps the most time-sensitive of all. The global debate over Chinese telecommunications security risks is not settled, but it is moving in one direction. Each year that passes, more nations are implementing Chinese infrastructure exclusions. The window to establish operational presence in European networks is closing. This agreement opened that window slightly for 5 specific nations at precisely the moment when it was most at risk of closing permanently. China did not make concessions at this summit. China executed a strategic time purchase. It traded future market access in categories where its competitive position was already strong for present positioning in categories where the window was closing. That is not a European victory. That is a masterclass in asymmetric negotiation. A study by the European Council on Foreign Relations, published in April of this year, found that in every major bilateral trade framework signed between China and Western nations since 2015, China's stated concessions had a median effective value of 67% of their nominal headline figures due to implementation gaps, technical standards barriers, and regulatory interpretation flexibility. Europe's concessions, by contrast, required legislative changes that were legally binding and technically specific. In other words, China has a consistent track record of signing agreements and then implementing the parts it finds convenient. Europe has a consistent track record of signing agreements and then discovering that its obligations are more binding than it understood. Nothing about this week's agreement suggests that pattern has changed. There is one more layer to this story that the European press is largely omitting, and it involves Washington. The timing of this agreement did not occur in a diplomatic vacuum. The EU-China summit was accelerated by 4 months from its originally scheduled date. That acceleration followed two specific events: the Trump administration's announcement of a 17% baseline tariff on European industrial goods in March, and the subsequent failure of US-EU trade framework talks in April. Europe did not pivot toward China because it preferred Chinese terms. It pivoted because American trade policy created a bilateral deficit, not in dollars, but in security. European industrial planners operating under simultaneous pressure from American tariffs and Chinese competition concluded that a structured accommodation with China offered more immediate economic certainty than continued reliance on a transatlantic relationship that had become unpredictable. This is precisely the outcome that China's strategic planners have been modeling and patiently waiting for. Every time American trade policy applies pressure to European allies without offering commensurate support, it creates a wedge. Every wedge, applied consistently, eventually opens a door. The door opened this week. China walked through it. For the United States, the consequences are significant. The transatlantic economic architecture that has served as the foundation of the American-led international order since 1945 has just been partially mortgaged to a rival power. Not destroyed, not abandoned, mortgaged. The payments on that mortgage will come due in the form of European hesitancy to align with American positions on Chinese technology standards, on digital infrastructure security protocols, on rare earth supply chain coordination. The $8 trillion EU-China framework is not just a bilateral trade agreement. It is a partial decoupling of European strategic priorities from American strategic preferences. And it was made possible not by Chinese diplomatic brilliance alone, but by the consistent American failure to offer European partners an economic alternative worth preserving. Europe secured export relief for industries that were genuinely under pressure. That is real. The luxury goods producers, the pharmaceutical companies, the specialized machinery manufacturers, they will see genuine benefit from reduced market barriers. But Europe did not win the $8 trillion question. Europe signed a framework that locks in Chinese upstream control of the industries that will determine European competitiveness for the next 30 years. It did so in exchange for downstream market access in categories that are valuable today and will face increasing Chinese domestic competition tomorrow. The mechanism is not new. Established powers with mature industrial advantages have been making this trade for centuries, exchanging present market wins for future structural dependencies. Britain did it in the 19th century with its imperial trading partners. America did it with manufacturing nations in the 1990s under the logic of comparative advantage. The pattern always resolves the same way. The party that controls the upstream wins. The party that celebrates the downstream loses slowly, then suddenly. Europe is celebrating this week. China is building the next decade. And in Washington, policymakers who drove European decision-makers toward Beijing with unilateral tariff pressure are watching the consequence of their calculation unfold. And one hopes beginning to understand the mechanism that they have set in motion. The $8 trillion question has been answered. Europe did not win. China did not need to. It simply needed Europe to believe otherwise long enough to sign.